right. Well, welcome today, everyone. I'm Kara. I'm the Adult Services Librarian. I'm so excited to host this program. Today we have with us Rick Bernstein.
Yes.
Who is a historian. He worked with the Wisconsin Historical Society for 30 years before he retired, and now works at the Dane County Historical Society. So this program has been made possible by Beyond the Page, and after the program I will have some surveys that you can fill out about the program, and otherwise I'm excited to hear from Rick.
Okay.
So again, thank you all for coming out and braving the cold on one of the coldest days yet, and I hope you all enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. So thank you. Thank you for coming out on such a cold day. I appreciate your interest in the topic. This is something I put together with the help of the Dane County Planning and Development, Beyond the Page, and EVU Foundation, and also Dane Arts. And Wesley Sparkman is here. He was involved with the original project. So a lot of thanks to everyone who was involved and helped me along the way. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more information over and above what you see in the exhibit behind you. And let's just get started. So Kara mentioned that I used to work for the State Historical Society. I worked there 30 years. About 6 years ago, I retired and started working with the Dane County Historical Society. And they're located in Lake Farm Park at the Lucier Family Heritage Center. We have a small archives in the basement. It's a little out of the way, so our catalog is all online. So if you do want to look for things, it's really hard, and not that hard, to go to our website, danecountyhistory.org, and see what our collection holds. But I do invite you to come out if there's something of interest. We do have office hours. So if you find something on that catalog and want to see it, just get in touch with us and we'll set up an appointment. So this is kind of where it started for me. I read these articles. This is one of dozens that come up every once in a while. Someone discovers that there's a deed on their property and they had no idea where it came from or why. And then it becomes a project for them and they start to talk about it. But I think this is probably because we haven't talked about it. We don't do a lot of education about racial covenants and racial discrimination in general. And so it's always a surprise. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this project is kind of try to fill that void a little bit about racial segregation in America, but racial covenants in particular. Here's one closer to home. McFarland student found a cites Elvium, Conrad Elvium, who was a president of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He came from McFarland and they named a school after him, primary school. And so she petitioned the school board to change the name of Elvium Primary School because he was involved with a covenant in Tacoma. I don't know to what extent he was involved, but in fact, the school board did change the name. And so I talked to the principal. He came to my first presentation and I said, you know, I'd like to work with you and maybe do some education about racial covenants. You know, you're working with school kids, this would be an opportunity. Unfortunately, he didn't take me up on it, but I think, again, that's where that void is, the educational void on what racial covenants are and what it represents in the whole. I mentioned I got involved. Dane County Department of Planning and Development started this project called Prejudice in Places. It was originally called Mapping Prejudice, but they changed the name along the way. Started in 2022. They've scanned 250,000 documents, those that have been digitized, and they found over 1,000 documents that held covenants. The 1,000 covenants affect 4,000 properties. And there may be some yet to discover. Like I said, a lot of the deeds are digitized, but there are a lot that aren't. And Wes and some of the people at the Boys and Girls Club have been involved in looking at some of those covenants. So this is the interactive map as it stands right now. You can see that there are certain clusters on that map. So, oh gosh, that doesn't work on this screen, I'm sorry. But here you have Shorewood Hills. I think this is Spring Harbor. You have the west side of Madison, and this is Crestwood, which we'll talk about in a bit. And this is Monona, where I live. It's the third most covenants in the county, Madison being first. So you could go to this map, click on it, and then see the racial covenant that was included as part of the deed for that property. So I was able to see the racial covenant on my property, and again, it just spurred me on to do more about the topic. Here's a closer view of Monona, kind of a blow-up view, and you see that there are smaller and larger covenants. The blue are smaller covenants, probably from the 1920s. That's the color blue. The yellow and orange are plats. So these racial covenants wouldn't be on a single house. They'd be on the entire plat. So where I live in that orange, almost square area, 106 homes were included in a single plat, and one racial covenant covered all 106 homes. So what are racial covenants? Racial covenants are clauses inserted into property deeds to prevent certain groups of people from buying or occupying land. And this is the deed from a plat across the street from where I live in Monona Homestead Highlands. And you can see there are several different covenants or stipulations. So no noxious or offensive trade or activity shall be carried on in said plat. But it also includes that mention of only members of the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any dwelling on said plat, excepting that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. So they usually had that exclusion for workers or domestic servants who were in the plat or living or occupying part of the plat, but as a servant. Some stats that the Dane County came up with in terms of the number of plats or racial covenants that were placed on deeds. And you can see in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there's a really major growth of racial covenants. And later in the 50s and 60s, they kind of dwindle out. They don't disappear completely, but there are some laws we'll talk about that kind of prevented it from going on. And also you can see that the language, they would key on these words to do a search on their number of digital records that they had at their disposal, the Dane County Planning Department. And you can see the terms where that word came up in a covenant. So when it says Caucasian, it's not preventing Caucasians, it's just using the word non-Caucasian as a way of preventing people of color from living in their community, and people of non-native descent. But overwhelmingly, racial covenants were targeting people of color, blacks in particular. So racial covenants. Covenants go back a lot longer than racial covenants, and they probably originated with Frederick Law Olmsted. He was a very famous landscape architect, designed Central Park in New York City and Lake Park in Milwaukee, but he did a lot of suburbs, like 370 suburbs. He felt that there was no great city that can long exist without great suburbs. And at the time when his career came to an end, he had designed upwards, perhaps as many as 370 suburbs throughout the United States. So he really set the template for designing suburbs. In 1910, there was an experiment, I'll call it, in Baltimore and some other cities where they would create racial zoning. And basically it forbade someone from selling to a black person if it was a white block, primarily white block, or sell to a black person or a white person if it was a black block. So that was started in Baltimore in 1910, but in 1917, the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. So that form of segregation came to an end. But at the same time, people were experimenting with racial covenants, and this is probably the first example of a racial covenant placed on a suburb in America. Edward Boughton was a land developer in Baltimore. He started a development called Roland Park. You can see some of the photos of that area. It was really targeting the wealthy and upper class, and he put in racial covenants at that time. It's interesting because there's a mass of information about Roland Park in the archives at Johns Hopkins. And there was a letter from him in 1892 to his lawyers who said, "Can I put racial covenants on my property?" The lawyer said, "No, it's against the 14th Amendment." But nonetheless, he went ahead and probably was the first example that we know of using racial covenants in America. Boughton hired Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. There was two of Frederick Law Olmsted's sons who teamed up to create a successor firm called the Olmsted Brothers. He was very much on board with the use of racial covenants, and he actually developed another tool called neighborhood organizations that would be used to recruit people to sign racial covenants, but they would also be there to monitor and police if someone sold a property to someone they weren't supposed to, quote unquote, not supposed to. He was a professor at the Harvard School of Design. He was a founding member and president of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And through those academic and professional organizations, he spread the word about racial covenants. And so they proliferated beyond Baltimore pretty quickly. This is a couple examples of communities in Wisconsin that had racial covenants. You see the sign on the left was a welcoming sign at the outskirts of Wauwatosa. They mention restrictive zoning, and that was a selling feature that these neighborhoods were protected with racial covenants, so you could be sure of your investment. Maple Bluff on the right was a very early plat, 1926 in Dane County. And again, it's the use of a plat. A single covenant could cover several properties. Racial covenants really picked up, I think, a lot because of what's called the Northern Migration. And that was when about 6 million blacks migrated from the south to the north and to the west. So there was one period that was very strong after World War I, and you can see those lines going up into the northeast. And then after World War II, there was a subsequent northern migration that went out west. And basically these followed where jobs were, and mostly industrial jobs. So they were leaving the south not only because of agricultural diseases that was causing the crop not to be as strong, and therefore there weren't as many jobs, but also just to leave the violence and the life that they had to leave in those southern states. On the right is a photograph of the Arthur family that left Paris, Texas in 1920. They left after two of their sons were lynched. And when the Chicago Defender heard about their case, they brought the family up to Chicago. And they took that picture, and it was publicized quite a bit. And it's still used in a lot of academic books to illustrate the northern migration. Parenthetically, I just mentioned this. This is a Wisconsin example of a building called Fairbanks Flats, where Fairbanks Morse sent recruiters down to Mississippi and recruited 250 black families to come up north to work at their factory. During World War I, it was very active, and they were having trouble finding workers. And so they brought them up, and they built 4 of these cinder block apartments. Each building, each of the 4 have 6 apartments that are 2 stories. Very simple. It's now on the National Register. And I think the community kind of celebrates those properties as the start of what was a black community in Beloit. Another precursor to the acceleration of racial covenants were race riots. And I put that in quotes because it really wasn't, it was actually a violence that was visited on all the black migrants that came up north. One of the biggest was in Chicago in 1919. You see the front page of the Chicago Defender, a black-owned newspaper that's still owned in the family and still active and printing in Chicago. Riot sweeps Chicago. There was a boy at a swimming beach that didn't know it, but he had drifted into the white side of the beach, and he was stoned and killed. And blacks were upset that blacks were being arrested and not whites, the whites who actually caused the violence. And so there was a week of rioting, and several people were killed. In Tulsa, there was a similar riot in 1921, precipitated by a false claim of some black man raping a white woman. But they targeted Greenwood, which was a neighborhood in Tulsa, mostly by blacks. It was very successful. It was called the Black Wall Street of the West. And so that area was particularly targeted for retribution. And it included not only on-the-ground violence with shooting and whatnot, but also airplanes were used to bomb the area. So it was almost completely destroyed. There were lots of consideration about reparations. There's still 2 people alive who lived through that riot, and so they've been trying to get reparations, but as of yet, they haven't been successful. In 1926, the issue came up in front of the Supreme Court about whether racial covenants were legal, and the Supreme Court said, yes, it was. So it really cleared the path, and it was going to be clear sailing for the use of racial covenants from that point until there were later decisions by the Supreme Court. But there again, you see the use of restricted. You'll see it in magazines and other real estate advertisements in Madison and Dane County when they use the word restricted, talking about racial covenants. This was the house, the subject of the Supreme Court decision, where ultimately they said the sale was invalidated because it had been sold to a black man. And then again, covenants find another accelerant when the New Deal housing program started under the Roosevelt administration. He developed a list of programs, and one of them was the Federal Housing Administration. And they required racial covenants for any loan that they underwrote or mortgaged. So that definitely accelerated the use of racial covenants. Another aspect of racial discrimination were these maps. So these were developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Just was reading about them. Richard T. Ely, who was a very well-known economics professor at the University of Madison, was very involved with developing projects like this throughout the federal government and throughout businesses and industry. Here you have 4 different colors, each representing the risk involved in whether or not loans should be issued. And the areas in red were the 4th of 4 and so considered the most risky. So they were the less likely to get loans for those properties. Another Supreme Court challenge came up in 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer. There was a home that was purchased by the Shelleys, and it had a covenant on it. So it went to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall and others argued the case. The house was this one on the bottom right-hand corner. It was in the area called the Ville, which was one of 3 areas that St. Louis real estate agents agreed that they could sell to a black individual. So they really limited where they could sell properties to African Americans. In this case, the Supreme Court found for the Shelleys, who continued to live in the house in the second generation, Chatley Williams, the smallest person in the family on the left, continued to live in that house until she passed in 2020. But this really overturned a law at the time saying that these were considered unconstitutional because they broached the 13th and 14th Amendments. These were the judges at the time. You'll see some of them are whited out. 3 of the judges recused themselves because they had racial covenants on their property. But the other 6 did vote unanimously in favor of Shelley versus Kramer. And they've kind of, as the law does, it distinguishes between government action and private action. So if it's a private action, it's not covered by the 14th Amendment. If it's a public action, it is covered by the 14th Amendment. And they said in this case that the courts could no longer enforce racial covenants. So they took the law or the legal aspect out of it. But that private agreements between individuals were still legal. But it was probably this decision in 1948 where you can kind of see racial covenants are no longer being as used as much as they were before. Still, there were individuals and federal agencies throughout the United States government who did not want to follow the court's ruling. And in this case, the administrator, Franklin D. Richards of the FHA, says that he didn't believe it was the policy of the government to require private individuals to give up their right to dispose of their property as they see fit, as a condition of receiving the benefits of the National Housing Act. So there was kind of a delay in terms of how long it took for the FHA to recognize the Supreme Court decision, and that's probably not a unique example. Bringing it back to Dane County, this is my house. I live in Monona. These were the 2 individuals who lived in the house originally. They had 4 daughters, and I heard from a backyard neighbor, she remembers how those 4 daughters monopolized the party line that they had on the telephone. So they always said, oh, it's hard to get on the phone with those Dahlman daughters always using the phone. And these were some of the advertisements for that Winnequa Terrace area that I lived in. You can see the outline of the development, the plat. You can see 4 different house models that they advertised on the top of the middle page, and that Roy Gannon company that I think is still in effect were the developers of this property in 1950. And here you see another ad, and towards the bottom it says GI and FHA financing available, and this is in 1950, which is 2 years after the Shelley versus Kramer decision. And so in 1949, the Solicitor General, Philip Perlman, who had argued the case in Shelley versus Kramer and was the U.S. Solicitor General, sent out a circular saying FHA could no longer insure mortgages with restrictive covenants. But still, here in 1950, we see that's not the case as of yet. Another example in Dane County is Crestwood. You can see the outline of the development. It's just outside Owen Park, that green area to the left. And the designer, or the main person who put that plat together, was John Bordner. He was a land use planner at UW-Madison, had lived in Sweden where the idea of housing co-ops were already in effect. But this is probably the first co-op that we know of in the United States. So in that case, each person puts up a certain amount of money, and as a group, they buy the house. And so they all have shares in the corporation. They govern as equals within the co-op. But there was one individual here in Madison, Carson Gully, who is well known as a chef at the UW-Madison campus. He had lived on campus most of his life before this because it was so hard for him to find a house in Madison. The campus created an apartment for him in what's now Gully Hall, but still he wanted his own house. And so in the 1940s, he tried to buy this house, but there were a group of residents of the co-op, about 38, that signed a petition saying not to accept him into Crestwood. Luckily, it was brought to the full board, and like every member, to vote on, and the vote was 70-30. So they were allowed to buy this property on Cedar Place, and it was from that building that he actually broadcast his television show that became quite popular on public television here in Madison and throughout the area. I've also heard there was some discussion, not a lot. There was a footnote in this one article that said Harry and Velma Hamilton and their family also tried to buy a house in Crestwood and were not successful. I don't know the particulars, but I'm going to continue to research that. But the Hamiltons were very involved with the NAACP and in education, and were stalwarts in the community in Madison, both black and white. The Board of Realtors was also an obstruction. They had a code of ethics going back to 1924. And one of the items in their code of ethics was not to sell to an inharmonious element. And so very often that was code for black into a white neighborhood or white into a black neighborhood. And this oral history that was done by Muriel Sims, it's mostly oral histories with people who lived in the black community. But this is one of the exceptions. This was a white woman, Fran Rumika. She was a realtor here in Madison, and she was called up in front of the Board of Realtors for having sold to a black individual in Madison. This was after World War II, and she said that kind of thinking just didn't seem to sit with her, and so she ignored that particular part of the code. But as a result, she was called up in front of the Board of Realtors. She was fined $500, and she lost her license. They said for 3 months, but she never went back. She just got out of the real estate business at that point. But you can see how the Board of Realtors were having their own impact on racial segregation. So this was the big law when it came to racial covenants. This is the law, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, that ended the legality of racial covenants, whether they were private or public. You can see Senator Edward Brooke, the only black in the Senate, a Republican from Massachusetts, and Senator Walter Mondale, senator from Minnesota. They were the co-authors of the bill. And it was the last of the 3 major civil rights laws that were up in front of Congress during the 60s. This was very difficult to get passed. The other 2, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, were not as hard to get through. Mostly there were Southern Democrats who didn't want this law to go through. But it was introduced in 1966. It was stuck in Housing Committee at the Representatives. But it was passed just a week after Martin Luther King was shot. And it was Walter Mondale who got up on the floor of the Senate the day after Martin Luther King was shot and said, we need to pass this housing bill now. And that's what got it out of committee and finally signed by LBJ in the center of that photo. It also created a new department, Housing and Urban Development. One of the first secretaries was George Romney. You can see him on the left. He's in shirt sleeves there, and he's walking with members of the NAACP in Grosse Pointe, which was a very upscale white neighborhood just north of Detroit. He was an adamant supporter of civil rights. But unfortunately, the president at the time was not. And he really pulled Romney back from doing many of the things he wanted to do to enforce the new Housing Act. And these are things he said openly about why he did. I am convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, that forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong. I realize that this position will lead us to a situation in which blacks will continue to live, for the most part, in black neighborhoods and where there will be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools. He said it then, and it's probably almost as true now as it was then. We really haven't gotten much further than that point in terms of undoing racial segregation, especially in the suburbs. Walter Mondale, 2018, about a year before he passed away, wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times, and he said it was the civil rights we ignored. So after all those many years being out of the Senate, he saw how the law he had written had never been fully utilized. It's still not being fully utilized. It's there if we want to use it, but we just need an administration and the political will to really make it happen. I suggest these 3 books if anybody wants to dig into this subject. This is a great way to start. The book on the left really details all that had happened in Roland Park and with Edward Boughton. It's a very detailed expose on all the things that happened with that development company. The middle book, Unjust Deeds, is a real close look at the 1948 legal decision, Shelley versus Kramer. And on the right is more of a chapter book. It's really meant for young adults. I think it's a much easier read, but it really looks at this conspiracy of heroes. Who were the individuals behind the purchase of that property that made it possible for the Shelleys to buy? 2 other books, The Color of Law, that really details that distinction between public and private. And the things that people often think are private probably aren't as private as they think. So he really talks about all the de jure, all the legal aspects of racial segregation that probably should also be considered unconstitutional. So it's a really broad brush. It talks about racial covenants, but it talks about a lot more. And this book was actually part of a book group at Sequoia. I recommend it for other libraries to consider. And Just Action was a follow-up to Richard Rothstein's book. His daughter Leah co-wrote Just Action. And it's really a menu of options that communities can use to really kind of move the needle on racial segregation. So again, I think that would be a great group read. What is being done locally? Well, in Monona and the city of Madison and Dane County, they've all passed resolutions which repudiate racial covenants. The Dane County one was passed February 2025 of this year, and we're very proud to see that. Where I live in Monona, it happened before I got involved with the city council. I'm an alder there now, but they recognize the issue. You're also able to file a release. There was a new state law that was passed last year by Governor Evers. It allows you to file a repudiation and release onto your deed. So it's It doesn't have any legal impact, but it does kind of state, it's kind of a statement of resolution, that this is how I feel about the covenant on my property. And again, to all the funders and people who helped us along the way, particularly beyond the page. So thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you guys might have. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so since most of these covenants in Dane County are rather dated, when was the last time one of them was invoked?
I believe it was 1965, and it's a property that's not there anymore. It's actually underneath CUNA. So there's that racial covenant. That was the last one. And I don't have the particulars on that, sorry to say. I know the first one was 1911, and it was a commercial property right on the square, which is unusual. Most of these covenants are for private property. And I haven't researched that one in particular either, but that's the range, 1911 to 1965.
Is there an active movement in Dane County to actually, well, as you pointed out, these documents that with these repudiations, but what do you have to do to take it to the, I mean, this is just a statement.
Right.
It must take something major to get it off the deed.
Well, actually, it's not legal to take it off the deed. There are some states that have made that legal, but in most they haven't, because the deed is a record of everything that happened to the property, and you can't take it out because then you'd be missing part of the history of that deed. It's not something that can be easily expunged. And so what the governor has signed in that recent act was a way to reach into the deed and have a statement of resolution of your concerns. But I think the bigger question is, what can we do about racial segregation? And that's a tough project. What I'm trying to do with this is just educate people about the situation, give them a broader awareness, and I think the more people understand the history and the background, the more likely or more able they are to kind of deal with the issue at large. So to me, I'm kind of just setting the table, and hopefully there'll be a lot more thinking to follow. But yes, it's a big issue, and one we just haven't come fully grappled with. Seem to avoid it more than anything. Wes.
Thank you, Rick, for the presentation. In the picture, I think that you had also Thurgood Marshall was pictured.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mention that.
Of the 1968.
Yeah, he was there.
I just realized that I hadn't noticed that because I've seen the presentation before.
Oh, okay.
I didn't notice because, you know, then you have the Supreme Court representative
Right.
as well, as long as it was the Senate.
Yeah, I mentioned his name when it came to Shelley versus Kramer. He had argued that when he was with the NAACP. After that, he became the first black justice on the Supreme Court. And so he was there next to Walter Mondale.
Yeah, I wonder how often they have Supreme Court justices in.
I don't know. That's actually
So that's kind of
not, yeah,
a couple of branches.
there he is. So yeah, he's the one all the way on the right. Yeah, and so I don't know if he was directly involved with the legislation or he was there because he's been dealing with this issue as a private citizen much before he became Supreme Court Justice. Okay. All right, thank you very much. I'm glad you all came. Let me know if you have any questions. I appreciate your attention. Also, I have a couple books here. If anybody wants a history of Dane County history, I have a couple free copies. If you want one and you don't get one, let me know. Send me an email. And also have membership forms. We have an introductory offer, $10 to become a member of the Dane County Historical Society. And there are some free newsletters that you can grab and take. All right, thank you.
These histories are free.
Those are free.
I would be willing to pay